So thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation to be here today. I have the complicated mission to keep you awake after lunch, which I will fail. Hope not. But we'll see in 20 minutes' time, I hope. So I'm here, as Tom already said, to present the paper I've written together with my co-author Anders, who is sitting here right next to me. And the paper will not be bringing you any new accessibility instrument. Instead, I will share with you a reflection that has been developing with the collaboration of several other researchers, some of which are actually here in the room today, so I hope they will agree. This reflection is on the challenges of accessibility planning and research. Anders and I have been concerned with the unreflected use of accessibility concepts and measures, and have been working on some challenges, and some of them we bring here today for this debate. We have developed an expert questionnaire recently. Again, some of you have contributed, so thank you. And we had 2 separate workshops involving researchers in the field. These activities have helped us to move forward in our reflection, and we hope that this opportunity again helps us to move even further on what we have been thinking on. One important starting point for this reflection, which I think is worth mentioning here, is the cost action which developed from 2010 to 2014, and which I had the privilege to chair together with Luca Bertolini. The cost section was concerned with the lack of implementation of accessibility instruments in practice, which will be one of the challenges raised here today. But in the end, it started to unravel a much more complex set of challenges facing accessibility planning, which are more deeply rooted into the conceptual ambiguity of accessibility concepts. And it has been here that Anders and I have been following this cost action research and developing some new research in. Also, in this discussion on the conceptual ambiguity, I would also like to refer and highlight the contribution of the ASOP Laboratory of Thought group, which has participated in 2 of the in the questionnaire and in the workshops I have referred before. So this is actually a joint reflection, and it's an ongoing one. So it's a fact that the word accessibility has increasingly appeared in the political discourse. And this could be seen as a positive thing in bridging the implementation gap. However, does this mean that the policy agenda has effectively assumed accessibility as a concern? In particular, has the political agenda grasped the meaning of accessibility-based planning in the context of sustainable mobility? And here I would like to emphasize the issue of sustainable mobility. The answer to this question will depend on which of these images provides the closest representation of what accessibility means to that policy agenda. And I would like to challenge you to think if you know which one your local authority would choose to represent more closely what their policy agenda is on accessibility. Well, I'm convinced I do not need to explain to anyone in the room the potential of accessibility in breaking the vicious cycle of unsustainable mobility and location choices. However, the unreflected use of accessibility concepts and measures may, in fact, only create an illusion of change. While actually, we continue the current practice where we are focused on increasing speed, providing more infrastructure, and in the end, continuing to fuel the unsustainable travel behavior and unsustainable travel location patterns that we have had so far. So I will start this presentation with a brief outline of the challenges we bring here today. And as hinted before, we have grouped them in 2 groups. The first is the lack of implementation and practice. And the second one is the conceptual ambiguity, which is more or less recurrent in both research and practice. Although we are now convinced, me and Anders, that the conceptual ambiguity is in fact the reason for the lack of implementations, we are going to start with the lack of implementation. for two reasons. First, because it has been more discussed in the literature, in the recent literature, and also to follow the timeline which brought us to this presentation here today and started with the cost action. With regard to the lack of implementation, most research has focused on limitations on usability and more recently on limitations on usefulness. The cost action tried to bring these two research fields together, but at the end it actually hinted at the third challenge behind the lack of implementation, which we here decided to call the insubstantial role of accessibility in the policy agenda. I will come back to this more in depth in a minute, but I would just like to finish this overview of the challenges I bring you today. So moving on to the second group, on conceptual ambiguity. Contrarily to the lack of implementation, this issue has vastly been unexplored so far. We argue here that there has been little reflection on what accessibility and how much accessibility we want, we need, and we should have, which are actually 6 questions, not 2. Okay? These will be the two structuring questions of the issue of conceptual ambiguity along the discussion. Starting with the first question, what accessibility? We present the argument that there has been a broad ill conception of the term accessibility in practice, but also among researchers. This is not only so in practice. This ill conception has in part been at the root for the lack of appropriation of the concepts by planners and policymakers, and to use the concept even without any meaning whatsoever. To this has also contributed the low adherence to real-life concerns of many of the measures we are currently developing and actually using in practice. And finally, we will give some examples of partial implementations of the concept and of the risks all of this poses. Regarding the second question, on how much accessibility we need, we are going to start the discussion on how much accessibility we need and also on how much accessibility is enough. So moving into the sufficientarism that Carsten referred before. And this discussion will take us to the potential of accessibility thresholds, which in turn raise another challenge, and this is the challenge of standardization and the consequent risk of loss of meaning, which, as we have seen before, was already low to begin with. Okay? We then end the discussion with the importance of matching standards to specific context and to overcome these previous two challenges, so standardization and loss of meaning. This scheme does not intend to be exhaustive about all of the challenges currently facing, but we just brought those that we believe to be the most pressing ones. So let's start with the lack of implementation. The cost action actually provides with, us with interesting numbers on the low implementation of accessibility instruments. Of the sample in the action, less than a third of the tools had been used in practice. And this is probably not even representative of the full dimension of the problem. And if planning support measures are not being used in practice, we have to ask ourselves how large is the implementation gap of the concepts and the concerns underlying accessibility. Okay? But we will go into this later when we talk about appropriation. Now we were talking about lack of implementation, and when we talk about the usability limitations and the research here, a lot has been said about the rigor relevance dilemma and about the gap between supply and demand of accessibility instruments, and we have talked about this before. So this is where the literature has been going. Not talking a lot about this literature because it's very extensive. Most of the field points into 3 main issues that have been summarized in a recent publication, which reflect the importance of simplification, transparency, and flexibility of accessibility measures to overcome these limitations of usability. And I think I forgot to say this in the beginning, but with usability we mean actually the ease of using the tool. Okay? So the results of the cost action, which are on the right, largely confirm the general literature and point at issues like the importance of real-time interaction or the importance of the communicative value of accessibility measures. Okay? But it's also important to refer another detail which was brought to us with a related research from Enrica Papa and her colleagues, and that showed that it is important to have interaction with practitioners. So the developers of accessibility instruments have to interact with practitioners to actually raise their awareness on the importance of usability. We could expect that accessibility instrument developers in the cost action would be particularly aware of usability literature because they were taking part of a research on usability. But still, a lot of them decided to change their tool after having this opportunity to interact with practitioners and following what the literature already said before the action started. And if we look at other accessibility instruments which are available in the literature, well, we could probably conclude the same. So there is a lot of research already being done on usability, a lot of conclusions being raised, but, well, accessibility instruments are still not following what is already available here in this area of research. Moving on to the usefulness limitations, here we are not talking about ease of use, but we actually want to see if the tool brings any added value to the process or the outcomes of the planning activity. At this level, the cost actually had a surprising result because although many developers decided to change their tools after interacting with practitioners had actually a very positive view of the tools and of their added value. So, supply and demand dichotomy doesn't seem to be the main reason behind the lack of implementation. Something else seems to play a more important role here, and we now decided to call it the unsubstantial role of accessibility in the policy agenda. We had some very interesting evidence of this in the cost action. There were 16 local workshops developed, and in these workshops we found out that planning practitioners actually don't really understand the accessibility concepts, or most of them don't really understand them, and that there was very little evidence that they are actually implementing any real accessibility-based policies or even integrated land use and transport policies to say. So in fact, the concept of accessibility seems to be present in practice, but the meaning and the underlying concerns don't seem to be there. This is in accordance with what was stated by Gers and we, so I'm trying to refer everyone in the room. They say that accessibility is often misunderstood, poorly defined and measured. And this seems even more so in practice than in research. But this is problematic, specifically if we consider that the concept is becoming fashionable. It's been around for decades, so it's not new, but it's becoming fashionable. Okay. In summary, these three challenges raise the obvious risk of lack of implementation, but can also lead to misimplementation, which can even be worse than lack of implementation, and to the complete disregard for accessibility concerns in practice, in spite of the use of the concept. The potential approach suggested by the cost action to deal with this challenge were twofold. The first is institutionalization of accessibility planning. It is suggested that legal requirements may help to bring about a clear role for accessibility and to help to bring about the understanding and the political debate. Of course, this institutionalization raises a number of new challenges and other problems which we will discuss in the second part. The second suggestion that comes also out of the cost action is that researchers should continue to engage with planning practitioners, not only to develop better tools, but to foster understanding and relevance. Again, this will be further explored in the second part. I think you remember that at the beginning I said that the conceptual ambiguity is in part responsible for the lack of implementation. So all these arguments that I have shown so far corroborate this. But now let's move on into the conceptual ambiguity to explore this further. So exactly what accessibility we want and need is a fundamental question which has largely stayed unanswered, but mostly even unasked. Four main challenges stand out at this level, and we are going to start with the first, which is ill conception. And here I had this fantastic reference which Karst already stole from me, so we already know that at the end of the 1960s, Gold said this thing, which is we have already seen before. Everyone uses it, but no one knows exactly what it means. And in fact, accessibility is commonly mistaken for more or less the same thing as mobility, and even used interchangeably in the political discourse. We are trying to improve mobility and accessibility. So everything is there, but we don't actually know what the difference is. In fact, it becomes hard to convince some researchers and politicians that they are talking about is not accessibility. For instance, sometimes there is a need to explain that talking about infrastructure provision is not necessarily talking about accessibility. Has this happened to you? Well, in addition, we have to consider the context of traditional transport planning we come from. Transport planning has early acknowledged that mobility is a derived demand. In fact, it's a way to obtain something else that people want, and this is not mobility but accessibility. However, that acknowledgement that improved accessibility can be obtained through mobility has evolved into two wrong assumptions which are very general in practice. The first one is that improving mobility will necessarily and always improve accessibility. And this is not necessarily so. We know that when we build a new motorway, it might improve accessibility in the short run, but in the long term, it may lead to losses of accessibility at the local level, because people decide to move differently or decide to change their house, for instance. Or even activities might close down and concentrate in a shopping mall. And this is one aspect. The other wrong assumption that come out of the first one is that accessibility is actually the only way to improve, mobility is the only way to improve accessibility. So we completely cut out the proximity issue out of accessibility, and we forget all about land use planning. And this is a serious risk when we are talking about sustainable development. So moving on to the second challenge, which is appropriation. If you ask most of the planners or politicians if they think accessibility is important, they will say yes. And if you ask them, do you want to improve it? They will say, of course, yes. But if you ask them, how much accessibility do you want to provide your citizens? They will not know what to answer, or they will say, well, as much as possible. This, together with the ill conception that we have seen before, reveals the lack of reflection behind the practical implementation of accessibility concerns. This means the concept is used without a definition or a value chain or priorities, and worse, it can be used with a completely different meaning. To this has also contributed the use of accessibility measures which have a very low adherence to the real-life problems we have. To give you just one example, I will refer a very commonly used indicator, which is the number of jobs accessible in a certain time. Using such a measure in practice may reveal that from a certain place, a person can reach 20,000 jobs in 10 minutes, and that building a new infrastructure will improve this to 25,000 jobs. Okay? This is very straightforward and a very interesting political number to be used in policy. But it has very little meaning to people. Also, just because you had a 25% increase in accessible jobs, does this mean you had a 25% increase in your accessibility? Does the household feel that its accessibility increased 25%? Well, these are just some of the questions I would like to leave on the table. So in summary, the ill conception and the lack of appropriation have led to unreflected use and even worse, to misimplementations of the concept in practice, which actually continue the predict and provide paradigm we were trying to avoid. To this has also contributed the use of accessibility with low adherence to real-life concerns, which even confuse the politician more and hinder the appropriation of the concept. Among the solutions, we point out the need to develop understanding around the concept. And one of the fastest and most effective ways, we believe, to do this is institutionalization, but only if the aim is to build understanding and not to build standards. Okay? Institutionalization in the absence of understanding can even be worse. To guarantee this, we suggest that there could be regulators or observers at the national or supranational level to follow the process. Another solution which might have a contribution is the one of developing more meaningful measures, and this is at the research site. So finally, for the first question, which was what accessibility, I bring you only 2 examples of partial implementation. There were many others, but which are more pressing. The first one is to use only single mode assessments. This is an example of partial implementation. The map you see here shows you the increase of accessibility with the building of a ring road in Madrid. The darker colors, the higher the increase. It's an obvious map. Although the map can be a good indicator, for instance, to see if there are inequalities in accessibility gains across the region, if you try to use it to decide if the motorway is to be built or not, there is only one obvious conclusion. Yes, because you only show advantages. Accessibility has maximum 0 increase, but it always increases. What the map does not show is what happened to the relative accessibility of public transport. Public transport will certainly lose competitiveness in comparison to the car. And it also doesn't show what happens to the local activities in the long run. Will they move somewhere else? Will they cluster into shopping malls and close down locally because now it's easy to get by car? So in fact, it says very little about sustainable mobility and about sustainable urban development. It still focuses on the assumption that we need to improve mobility to improve accessibility. Another example is that of the focus on the regional scale. Most of our accessibility levels are at the regional scale. Normally, when we think of calculating accessibility, we think of how far we can reach with travel times which go up to 30 minutes and even 1 hour or more, depending on the average travel time of a region. And because we are so pliant with our time, we have to use the fastest mode possible. So normally, accessibility analyses are done at the regional scale and for the car. However, this disregards, on the one hand, what accessibility levels are being provided at the local scale, so slower modes and close by to home. And it also disregards what happens to the local accessibility when you increase regional ones. So not only are local accessibility levels largely ignored, we also don't know what happens to them when regional ones change. I want to show you a very interesting example that happened to me during a discussion with a local municipality. In particular, when using a map on accessibility to school with 10 minutes walking. So the red areas where people have to walk more than 10 minutes to get to schools. And the schools are the triangles, the black ones. The map raised a huge discussion between the mobility and the educational department. The educational department had made a similar study, but with the maximum allowed time, which wasn't 10 minutes but 20, and with the fastest mode. And it reached the conclusion that the municipality was very well served by primary schools and was using that to close down schools. And this map, they were in the same room when I showed this map, raised a discussion between them after we had this discussion that we want to have this definition of what is the local accessibility, what is important at the local level, 10 minutes, and we talked about primary schools. But until then, this had never come up before. So, in summary, for this conceptual ambiguity, partial implementation produced biased understandings. It is possible to use these partial approaches in the predict and provide paradigm and use it to justify infrastructure provision or to justify closing down local services because you can reach it by cars. I'm pretty sure this is happening everywhere in every country, not only in Portugal that went through a financial very strong crisis. The development and use of relative accessibility measures and the inclusion of accessibility assessments in regional ones could contribute to overcome these particular challenges. In both challenges, the issue of meaning is again very important. So if we have meaning, then these misimplementations will also disappear. So we move on to the last question, how much accessibility? And here, this question was already implicit in the first one, but now I'm going to go a little bit into detail of how much. And the first thing we need to recognize, if we want to take accessibility-based planning serious, is there is a need to discuss and define how much accessibility we need, but also how much accessibility is enough. From an equity point of view, it's easy to understand the importance of minimum accessibility measures, so how much accessibility we need. And because of that, it's becoming frequent to find these thresholds in practice, but they are normally not legally binding, okay? They are there, but they are not legally. And regardless of existence or not of institutionalization, there is a general recognition that it's important to have minimum standards. The same cannot be said for maximum standards, how much accessibility is enough. Although people generally recognize that improving accessibility is not always possible, positive, not always positive, or even desirable, there seems to be a resistance to defining the maximums. And this brings us back to the political question, how much accessibility do we want to provide to our citizens? It's difficult to say not as much as possible, okay? The risk of not having maximum thresholds, however, continues to be to follow the logic of the more the better in planning, which is in fact the same logic that is followed by mobility planning and transport provision. Okay, and this is what we are trying to overcome by using accessibility. Here again, institutionalization of accessibility seems to be one of the ways to overcome this challenge. Because it's the building block to define accessibility thresholds or standards. And so we come back to institutionalization, I think for the third time. However, the definition of standards raises another challenge, and this is of standardization, which is different from defining standards. So standards should not be superimposed and should not mean standardization. So from now on, everyone needs the same accessibility everywhere, wherever you live. Okay, this should not mean this. And the second challenge is that, in fact, if standards were becoming standardization and superimposed, we might have an even more unreflected use of accessibility concepts, because people wouldn't need to understand what it means. They just need to have this number crunching exercise. Oh, I met the challenge. It's there. I don't know what it means, but okay, green spot. Recalling that institutionalization would only be good if it were generating understanding, meaning we focus on the process of defining standards instead of the standards themselves, okay? So it is clear there is a need to discuss maximum and minimum standards, but the discussion is more important than the standards that come out of the discussion, because it's the discussion that generates meaning and generates understanding. Finally, it's important to point out that the research that Anders and I have been developing has pointed already some fundamental suggestions at this point. So besides of defining that standards should be defined different for every local context, it also becomes increasingly evident that standards should be defined separately for each transport mode and separately for each scale to try to overcome some of the challenges that we have seen before, always separately. But in addition to this, you could also add new things that you could separate in these standards, for instance, different for social groups and others that you would like to address. So to conclude, it is our argument that to overcome the current challenges facing accessibility planning and research, institutionalization has a key role, but only if it focuses on the process of developing thresholds, and also that the thresholds are defined in a way that is context sensitive and separate, as I said, for every transport mode and scale or other issues like social groups. In the paper, we also defined a list of suggestions for the research agenda and the policy agenda. I only bring 2 examples of each. You can read the other ones in the paper. And I would like to, for the research agenda, I would like to first highlight the need to develop research on meaning of accessibility from different perspectives, exploring the value chain, which is highly unexplored. Anders has been researching in this field and has already found some relevant factors. So I hope he will share that with you if you ask him some questions in the discussion. And the second suggestion, he didn't know I was going to say it. The second suggestion is that on the need for research on the process of developing standards and how you can use that process to develop understanding, okay? Instead of a research on which are the standards, okay? So this for research. On the policy side, our suggestion is the first fundamental one is the institutionalization of accessibility-based planning, but this should be accompanied by national, supranational observers, as we have seen before, to guarantee that it's about understanding and meaning. And the second one is the need for political and policy debate on what accessibility we want, we need, and is enough. Okay? And we hope that this institutionalization can bring this about, but it will depend on the supervisors. So thank you for your attention. We look forward to the discussion. And I was a little bit provoking purposefully, so I hope it's caught your attention, but we'll see. Thank you.